So welcome. Well, what are we learning to defend in these weeks together? The resurrection. How important is it? Like the most. Okay? You know, I will say this. Unfortunately, in our culture today, we see some trends. I'm not saying you and I necessarily fit to these trends, but one of the trends is you see an increase in false and cultic religious expression. It's on the increase. In fact, they estimate there to be between 5,000 and 6,000 cults in America alone. It's a lot. The problem is, for many Christians and in many churches, biblical literacy is on the decline. And that's a bad combination. It's a bad combination. Now, why do I say that? One, to encourage us to not fit that mold, right? To know what we believe and why, so that we are strengthened in our own faith, but also in that we can have meaningful spiritual conversations with other people, okay? You might be able to answer a question or engage in a conversation with someone. But here is the best way to find out if some group might be cultish. And it's kind of go for the core, because a cult really by definition is trying to be deceptive anyway. They will most typically say, "Oh, we're Christians, just another denomination," to get you to be at ease. Immediately go, "Oh, we believe in Jesus," and they do, just a different one, just a different one. So it's always important to say, like, well, what do you mean you're also a Christian, or your group is also part of Christianity? Oh, we believe, in Jesus. And say, like, well, what do you mean by that? Tell me what your group teaches about Jesus. And of course, what you really can just say is like, well, tell us about the resurrection. And you will be able to identify very quickly groups, because you aren't going to become an expert in 5,000 or 6,000 religious organizations. In fact, why do we even know about some of them? Well, some of them grow to a decent size and stick around. They survive the founding person's teachings. Or they might remain small or small-ish, just do something bizarre. Think about what you're going to see in the news tonight. Are you going to see a news coverage of happy married couple celebrates 30th anniversary with a sweet dinner together? News at 10. No, it's always going to be something horrible and disastrous. And so the same thing happens with cultic deviations like that. So knowing about the resurrection, how crucial it is, and how to answer some of the main objections is super helpful for us. And that's our intention. Now, let me ask you this question. How many of you, perchance, have been able to see the movie that's out, The Case for Christ? Fantastic. One of the reasons why that's, I think, a good movie to see is it's the personal story of Lee Strobel. The book that many of you have gotten or will get is great, but it's the information that persuaded him, and that's the personal story behind it. The two things together are really great. And so just good timing for us. I guess in the future, if I teach this class, I'll say, get the DVD when it comes out, right? Eventually come out. Which reminds me, there is a DVD companion to The Case for Christ. Look at this one. A brand new shining one, right? This is the current cover if you get a new one. Mine is, it's right there. I picked yours up because I didn't remember I set mine. It's just right there. Mine's a little older, but they actually have a DVD companion. It's not the movie. It's just a DVD companion that goes along with this book, and you may find that helpful. In fact, sometimes people would rather watch something and read. I'm good with both. I think you should do both, because reading probably lends itself more to thinking than watching does. Okay? Reading something, thinking through, digesting the information and all. So I'm glad that you got a chance to see that, especially because, sometimes movies of this kind of genre, it's probably not going to stay out for much longer. Now, I don't know this. I'm not, the movie theater expert man here. But there's a chance it may not even be out in the theaters by this weekend. All movies peter out a little bit, right? Even the blockbusters over time. So if you haven't seen it, you want to, as much as you might be able to, try to see it before the weekend comes, just in case. I don't know that it's going out, and I certainly hope it doesn't. I hope it lasts another week or weekend's run. But encouraging you for that. All right, so a few books are sitting around. Here's my slightly older. There we go. Same cover. Okay, there you go. The Case for Christ. Now again, this is a strong suggestion, but I'm hoping that you can pick this up and read it. There are 4 chapters in the back that coincide exactly with our outline. And quite frankly, I don't know how to defend the resurrection, nor do I know any other apologist who defends the resurrection without following the logical sequence for what it is. Okay? And so the FEAT acronym that we use, he doesn't use it, but the material follows it. So we're going to go chapter 11 for tonight, 12, 13, 14. That's the last 4 chapters of the book. And he's just marked off in a table of contents about the resurrection. Okay? You know what's interesting about this book? Probably, since most of you saw the movie, you'll know this. This book is the material that he gathered to refute Christianity. He thought he could dismiss it. Now, I'm not sure the movie necessarily said this specifically. I had breakfast with him one time, and he said, I thought that in 2 to 2.5 weeks, I would have so dismantled Christianity and talked his wife, Leslie, out of it, that it would have been like a little side gig for 2 weeks, done, moving on. Okay? As he found good answers to his questions or information that kind of stumped him in that attempt, he did admit that it took him about 2.5 years before he surrendered his life to the Lord. What does that tell you about the human heart? Quick to dismiss, slow to accept. There's a former Muslim who is now a Christian, and he's on Ravi Zacharias' ministry team. There's a couple of them, but I'm talking about a guy named Abdu Murray. Abdu Murray. And so he said that because it was true in his own life, he said finding out the information that for Christianity being true is not hard. What's hard is being willing to accept it. So I don't think the information that we're going to learn over these weeks together, that you'll be blown away by how hard the information is. What you might be blown away with is when you talk to people that you would like to understand this, how hard it is for them to embrace it. And I think to some degree we have to give people time. We're impatient about this. Sometimes we talk to people that maybe aren't where we are a Christian commitments, and we think, I'll say a few things, I'll just overwhelm them, they'll just come to church with me, get baptized, we'll clap for them on Sunday morning, they'll get a cool t-shirt with the little circle on it and all the rest. Boom, boom, boom. But it doesn't always happen that way, right? So I don't want you to get discouraged if you are talking with people that you'd like to understand this information. Just give them some time. Everybody needs a little time to think things through. It's not a crime, right? It's counting the cost, maybe in a biblical phrase like that. Well, how many were able to read the chapter? Chapter 11. It's a sobering chapter, is it not? Because it's about the sufferings of the Lord on our part. Take a look at your handout. The front, I know that's just front and back, so what do I mean by the front? It's the front that has the key Bible verse on it. Okay? Key Bible verse. And again, it's a suggestion because I value scripture memorization. This would be a good one to commit to memory for our weeks together, and then of course it'll stay with you because you memorized it. But it's from 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In His great mercy, He has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil or fade, kept in heaven for you. No, it's not superfluous for the author here, Peter, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, to say that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Because that's the first thing that we need to deal with as we are talking about the information that we have. Now, on that same page, I have a reminder of what our outline is going to be. Our acronym is FEAT. Our argument is that the resurrection is the greatest feat of all of history. Okay? Or an accomplishment. Just that's a longer word. I don't have enough things for points for that, right? So feat works for us. The F stands for fatal torment. Fatal torment. And that's our topic for tonight. In the backside, we'll flesh that out a little bit. See if we can remember this. The E. Very good. Empty tomb. By the end, you're going to be able to know this real well. It's kind of why we do this. The A. Appearances of Christ. You're going to find that the empty tomb leaves the disciples and the apostles with a difficult enigma. You have a missing body, but you don't know what the answer is for a while. And then letter T stands for transformation of the disciples. Now, I'll tell you why I emphasize this in a few weeks. But just to remind you, we're talking about the transformation of the original apostles and the original disciples. Not necessarily about us. The caveat with that is, of course, the information we're learning ought to transform us. We shouldn't just walk away from it saying, hey, how interesting. That probably happened. Next thing to investigate, right? It should be transforming, but that point is really about the original disciples and the apostles. Okay? On the bottom of the front page, before we move on to the heart of the matter tonight, I just found this statement in the Baptist Faith and Message, and just thought I'd put that there as a good little blurb on the importance of the resurrection, and you can look at it there as I read it. The resurrection is the supreme vindication of Jesus' divine identity and inspired teaching. It's proof of his triumph over sin and death. It's the foreshadowing of the resurrection of his followers. Can we get an amen? Yeah, that's a hope. That is our hope. It's the basis of the Christian hope. It's the miracle of all miracles. Thought that was well stated, so I quote it for you there. Well, as we turn the page over, again, we have our fatal torment. If you haven't yet gotten the book, a reminder of what chapter correlates with this information in the Case for Christ, chapter 11. Now, interesting. Why am I opening with a quote from Isaiah? But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. The hint is in my parenthetical comment there. I've given you a rough date for when Isaiah would have written that. It's approximately 7 centuries before Jesus walked the earth. It's a powerful testimony of fulfillment of messianic prophecy, and that Jesus didn't just happen to suffer through things that happened to him, but he orchestrated all of this. And it's interesting to remember as we think about the material we're going to talk about tonight, and that many of you read about leading up to tonight in chapter 11, that he is not just simply suffering at the hands of mankind unfairly, though really he is, but he is the orchestrator of this. He willingly did this. And it's interesting knowing a little bit about the author of the book here, Lee Strobel. In the beginning of the book, that we're not really reading these chapters, you can see a skepticism just in between every line. But as we get to the section we are looking in, you can see maybe it's not always obvious, but kind of an imperceptible thing where the question he asks are no longer skeptical, it's like, yeah, well, what about this? Because he gets good answers, he kept just, well, yeah, what about a third thing? What about a fifth thing? What about an 18th thing? Here he's starting to deeply ponder, whoa, what does that mean? And we're going to see that as we get to the end of our lesson tonight. So what we're going to go through here is really answering what is the number one objection to the resurrection. And they're what we call swoon theory, or swoon theories. I don't know if we use the word swoon too much anymore. Can you guess what a swoon theory is? Well, maybe it's not a resurrection because, you know, he might have gotten better in the coolness of the tomb. Maybe it was a plot. Maybe he was involved in the plot. Maybe other people were involved in a plot that he was a little bit unaware of. But once we study the information we're going to tonight, whatever kind of swoon theory you hear about doesn't matter. You don't need to study the swoon theories. You need to let them express that and say, well, have you considered this? Because Jesus living through his ordeal is Impossible. It is impossible. So an answer that rather than it being a resurrection, that it might have been a resuscitation of some kind, we're going to see how improbable that is and not really a very good answer for what actually happened. Okay? Now, let me point one thing out here just before we dig into this information and take some notes. Does anyone know the year that Jesus suffered and died? 33. 33. Sometimes people are thrown off by this because what we don't know is the precise year he was born, but we do know when he died. Why do we know that better?
Because who was in charge at the time and all that?
Was Jesus as a baby super important in the world? But did he make a difference in his life, and then why they wanted to kill him? Right? And so it's very much public record. It happened in 33. There's a religion that says, well, it wasn't even Jesus on the cross anyway, to explain away the resurrection. Now, let me do this as kind of a timeline. Want to help me? Stand up right here. Playing the role of Jesus tonight? All right, here's Brett. Okay, 33. Remember this. Okay, 33. Now, I'm a religious founder of a new religion that starts in officially the year 622. I'm not sure this is to scale, but I'm really far away, right? So I have some solitary visions. I'm kind of like falling under a trance, and people look and they wonder if I'm in trouble, because that's what people wrote about this particular founder. And they said, is he okay? Is he okay? His friends were like, no, that's how the prophet gets his revelations. And he would come to and he would say things and people would write that down. In that time era, he said, I'm just getting these visions that Jesus, others, more visions than just this, but one of them was Jesus was not killed on the cross. He just left town and lived his days in India or something like that. Okay, there's a few different variations on this. If I was in 622, and this is how I get this information, what would you ask me? Can you prove that? Okay? So if I say in the year 622, I just feel really good about what I saw. That's my proof. Would that work? If I was going to prove in 622 what maybe I want to challenge what happened, what era do I have to go to? Do me and my pals matter? Let me make it an even shorter example. He's now Abraham Lincoln. You get to be famous people tonight. And I'm a lot closer to him now because let's say it's 2017, because that's today, and he died in, any history buffs? 1865. Good for you, 1865. So that's why the shorter little window of time here. So let's say I write a book and I say, Abraham Lincoln really wasn't assassinated. There's some conspiracy I come up with. It's pretty cool. Maybe he's a vampire slayer or something. Not sure where that idea came from. Maybe you think it was a bad movie I saw once. Okay. So here I am, claimed to be a historian in 2017, and I'm claiming that Abraham Lincoln did not get assassinated. I have other explanations for whatever it is. So you ask me what? Do I have proof? Well, I feel really good about this. Like, people forget things, and I don't know, whatever I would say. Does how I feel today make any difference about whether Lincoln was assassinated that year or not? A historian has to go back to the sources and look for paper articles, grieving widows, orphan children. Okay? He's done standing. He's done playing that role.
Or they could watch the TV show where they had the last living survivors, the witnesses of his assassination in about 1956.
Well, that's what's interesting. Sometimes if a young person saw something, in fact, it was only just weeks ago that the last person who was born in the 1800s passed away. She was like 117 or whatever, born in 1899, probably late in 1899. But you're like, that's staggering. Yeah, there's survivors. In fact, again, Holocaust deniers don't get a lot of traction right now because there's some that are still alive. But of course, in modern times, you also have videotaped testimonies. Their books they wrote about their occurrences. I've actually met a couple, and it's remarkable to hear their story. Of course, they were youngish when they suffered through the Holocaust and all. But again, you have to ask the contemporaries. So the question is, historically, what did those people see? And what is interesting is there isn't anyone for really generations, plural, that ever posited their explanation away from the resurrection that Jesus didn't die. Why? Well, who's the government that actually put him to death? The Romans. They weren't unclear about it. In fact, they would mock Christians sometimes by saying, oh, your God, so that's your God. We crucified your God. How much of a loser are you? They mocked Christians for that. Okay? What did the Jewish Sanhedrin or the leadership think? Well, they wanted him put to death. And they insisted on it, and then they pushed for it, and then they got that. In other words, no one did that. If someone's going to become a 911 conspiracy theorist, one thing that they can't say in our generation is, well, that's because the buildings are still standing, That'd be a terrible thing to say, because people would be like, I've actually traveled up there, and they're not there anymore. They've got memorials in another building, and, people come there and lay flowers and cry. Okay? So when we have people that are deniers of his death, it would never have been a contemporary. Friend or foe saw Jesus die, and they were either glad, maybe unconcerned, or deeply grieved, if they were family or friends, right? So Jesus' death on the cross is a simple matter of history, not the least of which is some of his followers wrote about it once they realized there was a reason to have a movement continue on. Okay? So let's talk about what happened to Jesus. And this is, again, these are things that are largely known and accepted by historians. Okay? And it starts with his torture. This is where you might want to write down a few notes if you want to. Okay? Now, by the way, I'm going to kind of sequentially go through this, and we'll hit a lot of them. But we won't probably be exhaustive. We won't probably say every single thing that he suffered, but we're going to cover the main ones. I'm going to start in the Garden of Gethsemane. What's the suffering that Jesus is enduring in the Garden of Gethsemane? Mental anguish. Why is he suffering from mental anguish? He knows what's about to happen. Okay? I think he knows what's going to happen to him physically. He also knows that it's quote-unquote unfair, to use our terms. But I think the main source of his anguish is that God himself is taking on the curse of sin. One of the ways we know that he suffered great emotional stress is a medical condition. It's called hemodiatrosis. Hemodiatrosis is a real condition, but it is a rare condition. And that is, I think someone had said it, or maybe a couple of you actually said it, it's where he sweated blood. Now, the medical doctor that is interviewed by Strobel in chapter 11 in the Case for Christ, I think he described it in a way that I thought was very helpful. Because if you're like me, when I first heard that, I'm picturing actually like it's an injury of some kind. Bleeding like you have a bad cut or cuts, okay? But it's not. It is, as the medical doctor says in the chapter, it is blood-tinged sweat. Blood-tinged sweat. So instead of it being some kind of bizarre, strange, mythical occurrence, it's actually a physical, human occurrence that happens when you have undue stress. Hemodiatrosis is what it's called. Now, that's the worst thing that he suffers physically. We're going to get to some of that in time here. But here's the shame of it. As though Jesus needed more torture. What hemodiatrosis does is it makes the nerve endings much more sensitive. Much more sensitive. So you would feel pain more so. You would feel pain more so. Jesus is being abandoned by all his friends. So he's alone. He's being treated unjustly. And we all hate injustice, right? Something unfair happens is we will complain. Find someone that, hopefully someone will listen to us in our complaints, right? Okay? Although once in a while you learn the lesson, I would complain, but nobody would care or listen to me, right? But we don't like being treated unfairly or injustice of any kind, and it causes us to complain, or at least want to. But he's taking on the sins of the world, And if he's who he said he was, he's God. And he's God. And so he's going to suffer greatly. Well, he gets arrested. More or less what happens to him when he is before the members of the Sanhedrin. It's an illegal gathering, by the way. That's a little part of it. But physically what starts happening to him while he's in the custody of the Sanhedrin and the temple guard. Beatings. I think that's probably the best word to write down here. Put down beatings. They would blindfold him and they would punch him. And they would mock him and say, oh, you're a prophet. Prophesize as to who just hit you. Okay? And pull out the hairs of his beard. If you've ever had to plunk just one out from somewhere, you're like, ouch. But having that done to you in that way. I think that would hurt. But it's not the worst thing that happened to him. Jesus goes before Pontius Pilate. What is Pontius Pilate's concern with all this matter? He's actually got a bad job in the Roman Empire. He actually was in trouble with the emperor because his job as a governor was to get enough tax money to make the emperor happy back in Rome, and he didn't want to hear about any troubles. And he's already in trouble with the emperor. And so when these guys come to him, he's like, why? I don't see anything wrong with them. But they keep complaining. Pilate saw no reason. By the way, what is the false thing that the Sanhedrin said to Pilate to try to go like, oh yeah, I'm pretty mad at him too? Because after all, what did the Romans care about Jewish people and their theology and any of their issues? They didn't at all. To them, they were just strange people with strange rules and strange customs that they could barely tolerate. Okay? So they go to him and they say, well, you know, sedition. They accuse him of some form of sedition. And so he investigates and he goes like, this guy doesn't have an army. I mean, one guy got a little bit mad in the garden and he told him to stop. So there's that. So he's like, yeah, I don't see that. They go, oh, well, you want us to report to Caesar about how things are going here? In other words, what happened to him was he was like, all right, better this one guy that I'm not sure why they want killed so bad dies so that we don't have some kind of outbreak of a battle, or maybe, quite frankly, he's probably thinking himself. Because the emperor he mad at him one more time, it might have cost him his life. Okay? Nowadays, thankfully, we just fire people, I guess, or don't re-elect them. I don't know the situation. But he would have lost his life for all of that. So, to get the Sanhedrin to maybe calm down without killing what he was calling an innocent man, they flogged him. Sometimes we use the word scourging as well. But why don't we use the word whipping? What's different between a whipping and the scourging, the flogging that Jesus received?
There's little bones and things on the tips of them.
Well, the simple answer is it's much worse. Now, being whipped on a bare back those 39 plus times, believe me, bad enough. Okay? However, this was worse because there were weighted material, weighted balls on the whip, and worse yet, sharp objects. So if you are whipped across your bare back one time with that, what do you have? You're cut, and you're probably cut badly. Okay? And bruising starts happening because of thuds. Okay? What happens if they keep whipping you over and over and over? It's ugly. If you've ever seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, the reason why that's a difficult movie to view, though I guess we appreciate what it means and everything, is that they happen to focus in that movie on the flogging more than the other parts of the story, largely. Largely. Most movies that are made about the life of Christ tend to show that briefly and then show him on the cross for a long time. Those movie makers, it's just, I guess, a theatrical decision, what you focus on, right? They flipped that a little bit and they showed the flogging for a greater length of time. So he is torn. Again, the doctor that's being interviewed by Strobel talks about this, and you're ripped open badly, and potentially you can see sinew, bone, internal organs. And the biggest problem that Jesus suffers from that flogging is what we call hypovolemic shock. Which means, what is he suffering from? Severe loss of blood. The body starts shutting down, trying to conserve what little hydration that it has. That's why when Jesus was later on the cross, he said, "I thirst." It wasn't merely hypothetical. He was in trouble. In fact, because they went too far with the flogging, they were supposed to stop. Apparently, they were practiced enough in floggings. They knew 39, probably you would live. Go beyond that, probably not. And they went beyond that. Here's the truth of the matter, just to cut to the chase. Jesus was really a dying man before he was put on the cross because he was torn so badly. Torn so badly. Severe blood loss. Now again, this next thing I'm going to mention is not, again, I don't think the worst thing that happened to him, but it's certainly not going to help. They did it to mock him. What did they place on his head? And so that would cut his head. How many of you have ever had a head injury of any kind, a cut? First time I cut my head, I thought I was going to die. I was a middle school basketball player. It's up in Minnesota where, unfortunately, I don't think they do this anymore. They had radiators in the gym along the side. So I dive for a loose ball, I get it, throw it to a teammate, and I hit it. And I think I'm going to have this giant, Mom, you remember this maybe? Were you there? My mom's in the room, so she remembers my stories. All right? Seems like a long time ago now. But I remember grabbing my head going, oh, I'm going to have the worst bumps. I go over to sit down on the bench. The coach says, let me see. And as soon as I do this, what happens? Blood's coming down. And of course, his reaction and me seeing my own blood, like we were both like, yeah, we're in big trouble. Now, it did need stitches, and it was a cut. You know, it wasn't like a slight thing. It was a deep cut and all that kind of thing. But I wasn't going to die. But it did bleed a lot. And so the point with the crown of thorns is, yes, the humiliation, but also physically, you would have the extra blood loss from that. Because head wounds do bleed a lot. And if you're a medical person in the room, you could probably explain that. We just know that it's true. Okay? For some reason, that's probably cool. So the flogging, do we understand more or less what's happening with the flogging? Okay? So Jesus is in trouble. This is why, as Jesus carrying his crossbeam to the hill to be crucified, what does he struggle with? Just carrying it. Okay? And so they finally look around, they find a guy, and they say, you got to help him out. The reason why is because he was already in bad trouble. He was in a bad way. Okay? And again, God was in charge of this ordeal, and so it wasn't going to happen. But if they somehow decided to crucify him on Monday, wait the weekend, take it off or something, you know, like that, I don't think Jesus would have been alive to have been crucified at that point. In fact, does anyone happen to know the approximate number of hours Jesus hung on the cross? 6 hours. It would take usually 9 to 10 if they used the spikes, which they did with Jesus. Sometimes they would strap a person up there, and then it could take longer. That was usually just, again, to make you suffer more, because it was meant to be a torturous death. By the way, if they're trying to teach a criminal a lesson and say, don't do that again, are they going to crucify you? Why would they crucify you? They're killing the person, and then they're teaching the crowd around, fear us. Don't step out of line. Okay? If they want to teach you a lesson and say, don't ever do that again, they might flog you or something else, because you could live through that. Then they would send you on your way. But they didn't crucify people to send them a message. They crucified people to send everybody else the message. And I'm quite sure that was received. After all, why do you think Peter, the boldest of the apostles, denied Jesus 3 times? He had a real reason to be afraid. A real reason. He wasn't being a wimp. In fact, if he was the wimp, he would have been the first one to leave and not hang around that long. We give these guys grief because their story's known a little bit, but he was the last one standing at least. And he was the boldest guy. At least he hung around for a while. But he finally, denied him the 3 times. Then, of course, he felt the guilt. And then Jesus later restores him. But there was a very, very real reason. So the flogging, the Roman flogging, not just a whipping, but the Roman flogging is a very, very real thing. Okay? Let's get to the crucifixion. Let's write down a few things about the crucifixion. Again, we may not write down or mention everything, but let's get the highlights here. Though I said sometimes in history the Romans would occasionally, not the majority of the time, but occasionally just strap someone up, tie them up to a cross, Jesus was affixed in the little bit more normal pattern of spikes. Now, spikes is a better word than nails. Why? They very much resemble railroad spikes that we use today because they were sturdier. They were sturdier because, after all, they're affixing a human being to a piece of wood. And otherwise, it wouldn't bear the weight there. Okay? And so you have the spikes being driven in. To drive them in, they also pulled your arms apart so that your shoulders would separate. Has anyone here, maybe if you're an athlete or a former athlete, I guess, right? Not that many young people in the room. Have you ever separated something in an injury or gotten hurt? Some kind of a separation? You know, the interesting thing about a separation, it's incredibly painful until they relocate it. And you can be better very quickly. Now, this is going back maybe 10 or 12 years, but I remember watching an NFL football game, and there was a safety. The only thing about football, safeties are kind of like, they're almost as big as a linebacker and almost as fast as a defensive back. And their job is to run and just like crush people. Okay? They're tough guys. Okay? This safety tackled somebody. It was one of those like, ooh, it was a big hit. But he dislocated his pinky finger. The reason why I knew that, I was watching this on TV, is because it was sticking out sideways all the wrong ways. Yeah, and that's exactly right. People going, oh. You're like, I have to look away, but I'm not, okay? He runs off the field like he was like in kindergarten. Ow, 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 ow. And you can see him on the sideline doing all this stuff. You got to remember, this is not some wimp. He's a safety in the NFL. And you see the trainer doing like a little bit of this, probably saying something, probably going like, hang on for just 1 second, guy. And they, the motion of somehow popping that back in. And guess what the guy's reaction was, the players? He walked up to the coach, like nodding, like just went back in and just started crushing more people, I guess, right? But while his pinky finger was separated, it was killing him. Well, when the shoulders are separated, when they affix you to a cross, when are they alleviating that pain? Not. Now, I'm not saying that's the worst thing Jesus goes through, but you kind of see what's been adding up here? For someone to say, and we're not even done, that someone to say that Jesus could have survived this ordeal does not really line up historically or even medically. You would have to have a wild hunch and kind of a blind faith. I'm just going to go with that, even though probably couldn't happen. Okay? I wonder if we can have more reasonable faith to know that he did die because he really couldn't have survived the ordeal. Now again, just a little bit, let's kind of, again, cut to the chase on this. He's going to suffer greatly on the cross, obviously. He's already hurt. He's going to only live 6 hours. I say only, and again, only because the contrast would be that the average person nailed to the cross would go 8-9 hours, but Jesus dies faster. And again, what's the basic reason why he does die faster? The blood loss was severe. He was already in deep physical trouble. So what does a person die from when they're being crucified? It's asphyxiation, which is the harder way of saying suffocate to death, right? Here's what has to happen when you're on the cross. You have to move up and down to inhale and then exhale. Why are you doing that? Instead of going, I'll just give up and die. Well, we all have that natural instinct to fight for our lives, and they use that in an evil way against the person. And so they're fighting up and down and up and down. Now, here's why that's important, though. If you're not moving, could you be faking breathing on a cross? No. Sometimes little kids will play games and do the hold your breath for a little while. Maybe it's going through a bridge, or not really a bridge, a tunnel. And somehow you're like, oh, wait a minute, he's been holding his breath. He said for he's up to 6.5 minutes, really? And then you want to hold your finger in the nose. You're like, I don't know, dude. But as soon as someone claims to be able to do that long, you say, okay, let's go to the swimming pool and I'm going to physically hold your head under the water for these 6.5 minutes you claimed you were holding your breath. You ready for that? I would love to be able to prove that, but I got to go. I mean, there's going to be some reason like I can't do that. Okay? So in other words, when Jesus is hanging there at the certain point, now Jesus knew he was dying because he said, it is finished. The irregular heartbeat and all the rest that he's suffering from is hypovolemic shock. But once he stops moving, the Roman guard will watch that. And what are they watching for? Will he also kind of try one more time or a few more times to keep going? When they now don't see him move, again, is it possible to fake that? Fake breathing, inhaling, and exhaling when you're not moving on the cross. Now, what's a Roman soldier's job? In this case, the guard has what duty? Kill 3 men in this case. Okay, they're not sure what it all means, probably, but they have 3 men who are in charge, 3 men. A guard is in charge of killing these three men. Once they see that Jesus is no longer moving, what is their assumption? Probably in the first 10 seconds, he might do more. 60 seconds later, hey, keep your eye on that. I'm not sure. That could be done. He looked like he's in bad shape, okay, etc. Once they don't see him move for long enough, again, what are they going to presume? That he's dead. They're going to presume he's injured. Oh, that's bad. Let's let him down and like nurse him back. Okay? Well, Roman soldiers get into a lot of trouble for not performing their duties. In fact, history is replete with Roman soldiers being killed in very creative ways that, again, would teach the lesson to other soldiers, don't ever be derelict in your duties. And so one of the things that they do with the dead man on the cross is they confirm it. Now, why didn't they break his legs? He's already dead. If he was still moving and they had had enough and it was time to go home, what would they have done to a still breathing criminal on a cross? Break your legs. Why? Now you can't do any, in other words, you would be still, you would just hang there, and then the suffocation, the asphyxiation would happen within whatever minutes you could even get by with that at that point. Okay? If minutes. All right? But they don't do that with Jesus. They take a spear and they thrust it in his side. And by the way, that's not some fanciful thing. That's something they would do to dead men on crosses. He wasn't the only person they'd ever seen dead on a cross. What this happens is they pierce the side with a spear. They're not kind of poking a little bit to see if he flinches. If you see war movies or heard war stories, sometimes people act dead and they walk around to see who's faking it and they kind of just poke around or whatever. No, they're not poking him. They're piercing his side. They spear him. And it goes through his lung and into his heart. Now, if Jesus had somehow survived all of that, which he couldn't have, but if he did, what is a spear in his side that pierces a lung and goes into his heart going to do? If any one of us healthy standing here, sitting here, gets a spear in our side in that way, we'll die from that, I suppose. Now, what comes out of Jesus is interesting, medically. You have the clear liquid and the red liquid separate coming out. Okay? Why? If you pierce the skin of a living person because their blood would be circulating, they bleed more. There's to be bleeding from that wound in some way. But that was a sign of death because it's called pleural effusion and pericardial effusion. Again, the medical doctor in the chapter describes this. What's also interesting to that medical doctor is he says, when these gospel writers are recording this, what would they have known about that condition really? It's clear evidence to him that they are truth tellers because they recorded what they saw, even if they're like, I'm not sure why that happened. They weren't going, I'm expecting this, I'm a medical personnel, I'm just here taking my notes. They're just people observing it, right? And it's somewhat of a distance and everything, but they see this. In other words, that is confirmation of his death. By the way, what happens when Jesus dies around him? Maybe like physically in the earth. There's an earthquake and there is darkness. Now, there's some earlier chapters in the Case for Christ that do a very good job of this, but there is evidence that on that Passover Eve in Israel, Palestine region, that there was an earthquake and darkness, because it startled people and they remarked about it in history. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I was a young Christian, when I read that, I'm going like, for effect. You know what I mean? Like a theatrical production, like a little extra or something. Just not, it didn't make me doubt anything. It was going like, oh yeah, I'm sure that's just a thing. Hyperbole maybe even, right? But when I found out that in history, historians referred to that happening on, I wish I could remember precisely, I think it's April 4th, the way that we would now count it, April 4th of the year 33. Maybe it was April 2nd, but to us that's not the most important thing, but it was the eve of the Passover, okay? That Jesus died. Earthquake in the darkness. Now that causes a lot of concerning nature for the people, so what are they going to do? Let's get out of here. So what do they do to the two poor souls on the either side of Jesus? They do break their legs. Why? They're still alive. They'd have hours to go because they weren't flogged and then crucified. By the way, most movies you see, they do a proper job of showing this. The Passion of the Christ certainly did. They showed them suffering from crucifixion wounds but not flogging wounds because they did one or the other, usually not both, but they did both to Jesus. Okay? So they break their legs, and again, that hastens their death. They have but a couple minutes to hang there and finish dying. Okay? Now, once Jesus is dead and they take him down, do you happen to know what the Romans did with the majority of deceased people that they crucified?
Threw them in a pile.
It's very inhumane, but they basically threw the body away. These old cities would have, garbage heaps somewhere outside the city, which you didn't want to live near, okay? But they would just throw them away. The reason why is because very rarely would someone be crucified and somebody go like, hey, that's my cousin. Hey, Roman guys, that's my cousin. They'd be like, well, what do you know? And by the way, you have to remember, would I say like, hey, you can't arrest me without my rights? Did the Romans give rights to anybody but other Romans? They killed you and it was unfair. They were like, oh, I just feel really bad. That poor Jewish guy, should have been mean to him. They're like, I barely care. I remember that. Okay? So people aren't going to go hang out too much. Now, that's not to say it never happened. There is physical archaeological evidence of people that were given a burial under whatever circumstances, because there's one, his name was Yohanan, John in Hebrew in the day, back in that day, who was buried, and they still had the spikes. They were still in his ankle bone and wrist bones. Of course, a lot of other, it's a long time ago, right, from that century, so a lot of other decay, of course, but they see that. So there is evidence that occasionally people were asked to be buried. But you had to get permission, and you had to hope you wouldn't get in trouble for it. So who needs to give permission? Let me start with that. Who needs to give permission to bury Jesus? Who's in charge? Pilate. So Joseph Arimathea, if you saw the Light production, whether in the past or its revisited way just before Easter, we know the perspective of Joseph Arimathea because the story is told from his perspective so much. He goes to Pontius Pilate with Nicodemus, actually. A couple of secret believers, you might call them, that aren't keeping it a secret anymore. They go to Pontius Pilate and ask for permission. What is Pontius Pilate's response?
He's already dead?
That's exactly right. He says to his guard, is he already dead? Go confirm that. Now, could Jesus of Nazareth, even if he wasn't special in any regard, he's not really the Son of God, we're not sure about that yet, we're just thinking it through, but Jesus of Nazareth, could he have survived that ordeal? Whether you think there's meaning behind it or not. Pontius Pilate gives us historical confirmation. He says, I need confirmation. His guard comes back, he says, oh, he's dead. And then he says to him, you can bury him. Now, he puts him in his tomb. You might know this. Tombs were unusual to have. You had to have a pretty good degree of wealth to own a tomb. So in other words, it's property. It's property. And so he was buried in a known tomb because Joseph of Arimathea owned it, and people knew where it was. And so they go and they bury him. Are they burying somebody who, like, I don't know if he's dead or not, I loved him, but either way, let's just do it anyway. Would they be burying out of their concern somebody who they're a little unclear about whether he was doing okay or not? Could Jesus have somehow swooned? lived through a plot. By the way, if this was a plot and Jesus isn't God, he was the stupidest man. For going like, hey, let's have a plot. I'll tell you what, I volunteer to be the guy that gets really, really hurt. I'd have been going like, this right here, Kent looks like he'd be better than me. I really think Kent would be better than me. I'm not that comfortable in front of a crowd. I'd be backpedaling. I'd be like, not me, not me, not me. Okay? So here he is, being buried in a very publicly known tomb. Okay? So how do we bury people? Now this, if you happen to read, how did they bury people is really the question. If you happen to have read chapter 11, the burial account per se and what this means was not in that chapter. So there might be new information to some of you. But when they buried people in that day, if that's the style in which, because there were other ways, they would take wrappings of cloths and they would take anywhere from 50 to 75 pounds of spices and they would apply it to the deceased. In other words, it was first century way of embalming someone. Okay? Now I'll give you this, is interesting. I was giving this talk at a conference, an apologetic conference. A friend of mine is a pastor out in Portland area and is out there and was kind of giving this information about the historical way in which they prepared you for burial. And so they apply all these spices on the body in the openings and then the wrappings, and it gets kind of gummy and sticky and then hardens. And it's a preserving, embalming type of thing. Well, I probably should have thought of this, but a medical doctor came after and just wanted to talk a little bit. He says, by the way, he goes, you know, you forgot to mention something. I'm like, well, maybe I did. And so he said, you forgot to mention how toxic embalming material is. That if he had somehow survived and things he could not have survived, the toxicity of the embalming material would have been poison. And he had more than a few cuts. And I said, well, doctor, I said, I didn't actually know that. I learned something that night, okay? In other words, well, it's no surprise though, is it? I mean, someone who's in embalming fluid, well, you can put that in your sandwich, a little spread before the, you know, put your bacon, lettuce, tomato, BLT sandwich. Yeah, you're like, I don't think so. Because it's to preserve a dead body as long as possible. Of course it's going to be toxic. And so not only that, but then the wrappings become hardened. So again, he couldn't survive this. This is like the 18th way we've seen that he had to die. But somehow he comes to in that, and he's going to, with his separated shoulders, break through, get up on ankles that had been spiked. And by the way, you know, often we see, you know, the portrayals of crucifixion, the spikes, but I think the spike through the ankles probably would have been more painful. And is he going to get up and walk after that? And then go to a stone that would weigh 1.5 to 2 tons, that's meant to be rolled side to side, push it from the inside with his separated shoulders on ankle bones he can't walk on, with no blood flowing, and push that and scare the Roman guards, boo, and then walk around, and then people see him and go like, hey, let's have a movement, you're an impressive guy. They would, if any of that could have happened, the one thing they would have said is, can we get you a doctor? As opposed to, my Lord and my God, which was the apostles' response that we will see in time. So the burial, even, is something that he could not have survived having been buried. Okay? Now, we're going to open up for some questions and comments. But I want us to see this concluding quote on your handout. Do you see it there? It's a quote from JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association. It's the journal for American medicine. And I don't know Dr. Edwards. By the way, Lee Strobel quotes him as well in the book. But I'm presuming he's a Christian. Probably got tired of people saying, well, maybe he just passed out. Okay? Here's what he said. Do you see the quote? Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. You may have faced this before, but you know what a lot of people's assumption is for Christians? You're foolish people who believe in foolish things for no reasons. I think the swoon theory fits a foolish belief for no reason, but I don't think the death of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross and a dead man being buried in a very well-known tomb with the burial spices and the wrappings, that's reasonable because it's historical and it's medical. And that's why, even though they persist as being the number one reason people give against the resurrection, I think that it's flawed and not very probable. Comments or questions for me?
Just want to use your take, like, because I've heard this. It's from Michael Shermer to even just more benevolent atheists who make the claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Right.
As opposed to, how do we deal with that? Like, to get them to understand that it requires adequate evidence versus extraordinary. Because it is an extraordinary claim, and that sounds to us like I have to have more than just reason. I have to have some sort of.
Really, what you have to do is you have to get people to think well. One of the things, again, if you haven't been able to pick up the book, I still want to encourage you to do it because it's so well done. Every opening to his chapters, he talks about a story from his days as a journalist. He was a criminal investigative journalist. In fact, he was an award-winning one. You'll see a very, very famous case that he's the one that broke about the Pinto and the fiery deaths. And it was a very famous case in the 70s, okay? And he broke that story. So he became famous for that. In fact, I think the movie alluded to that a little bit near the beginning as they kind of told the story about him, kind of the journalistic side of him. And the reason why he tells those stories is because he's trying to show that when we think well about how we investigate a crime today, or investigate whether is Ford culpable for making a dangerous car that people died from it, or were they like, it's just a mistake, you can't really sue us for that, or whatever. He said the reason why he tells these stories is because he's trying to get people to think normally about the evidence. Because people want to go like, well, spiritual things, anything could happen. I'm not sure about that. All we're asking right now is the swoon theory the answer to the evidence that we see? And so you have to take into account, and that's why this is a four-part, now, tonight, in the remaining three pieces of evidence, because what it has to do is you have to take into account everything that we know about this scene, the historical account. And so rather than looking for something magical, we're just simply saying, well, what accounts for this? Is the swoon theory able to account for what we know in history about what happened to Jesus of Nazareth? It's flawed. It fails. Well, then we need other things. Now, they will go like, well, what other things? And so you say, well, what's your objection? And they'll have more, and we'll keep going. But really, the whole point of the investigation isn't that this has to be some kind of bizarre, unexplainable set of events. It is something that you say, well, think about how you would investigate anything. And that's really the answer to that. I think what they're trying to do, they're just trying to stiff-arm the evidence, and really what they're trying to stiff-arm is God. When they say that extraordinary claim needs more extraordinary evidence than just that he probably died. Because they'll also hear and go, well, okay, maybe he did. But maybe there's this, and there's some other things that will come up. And so again, I think the whole point is to actually investigate to account for the evidence as we know it, rather than start thinking strangely and fancifully. Now, I don't necessarily blame people that do that because, not all religions are concerned about history. Does history matter to Christianity? Whether Jesus really lived or not, or really suffered on the cross or not, or really died and left an empty tomb? It's like, well, either way. No. One of the important things is that history matters to Christianity. And that means you can investigate it and you can pursue and seek, is it true? Philosophers call that just the falsifiability of a claim. If it's not falsifiable, then you can say, well, we can't even have a discussion about your dreams in the forest, Joseph Smith Jr., or whoever. Like, well, I set up something you can't even investigate. Well, then you can't know if it's true or not. So that would be my claim. Now, last week, I wrote up a name and I forgot to tell you why. I'm going to do it for you just for someone that you could Google search. He's got a great website. He's got great books. J. Warner Wallace. He has, his first book is called Cold Case Christianity. And then he's got a couple others. One that's coming out very soon called Forensic Christianity. Here's his deal. He was an atheist. He was a well-known, famous television guy. When people would want to talk about cold case homicides, whoa, these are weird cases, what happened? He was nationally known. He'd be interviewed on a lot of television shows for it. And I'm sure on reruns, he's still able to be seen on something, right? You've seen him, haven't you? So he's an atheist, and a Christian at work was saying, hey, you should, he's, religion, He says, well, you're pretty good at your job. Why don't you take your, cold case homicide detective skills and look into it? He goes, well, religion can't be looked at. He goes, oh, yes, they can. If they make historical claims, they can. He goes, yeah, you're right. And so he does. And when he did that, he has a sister who's a Mormon, still is a Mormon. She said, well, why don't you look into Mormonism too? And he did. And he said Mormonism lacks any truth-based claims and is not historical. And so he dismissed that and trying to talk her out of it. Maybe still is. Maybe she's come out. I don't really know the full story there. But what is interesting for J. Warner Wallace and why I'm recommending you in response to that question is that he looked into the evidence the same way he would investigate cold case homicides. And they were able to solve them. And of course, you have to go back to the actual firsthand witnesses and revisit testimony and items. And of course, sometimes it might have been something that's old enough that didn't have DNA testing, and now they can, and other things like that. I'm not a detective. I can't go much further than that with how that goes. But he's interesting for that investigation. And once he found it to be true, he's fired up. And so his work is very helpful, and I recommend him to you. Comment or question?
How do Muslim apologists deal with the overwhelming evidence for the death of Jesus Christ?
They don't really. Muslim apologetics is a bit of a misnomer even, because you're really not supposed to ask. You're supposed to believe. You ever heard the word dogma or dogmatics? Dogma or dogmatics, it says, this is what I told you to believe, shut up. I didn't ask you to ask a question. Like the military. My dad told me a story when he joined to go to the Korean War, and the sergeant says something like, any questions? And of course, what that means is, there's no questions. I'm telling you there's no questions. He said somebody had the foolishness to go, yes, sir. And then they had to run or hike or carry and clean or whatever they had to do. And of course, they all told him, never ask a question again, dude. They probably were more forceful than that. Okay? But in dogmatics, you're actually told not to ask the question. Here's an example, and it's a very sad one. There's a ministry called the Voice of the Martyrs. And basically what it is, it's a ministry based out of Canada that tracks Christian persecution around the world. And you get these weekly updates. It's always sad because there's Christians being arrested, persecuted, maybe killed. And just days before 9/11, this case came up. There was a schoolmaster at a Christian school in Pakistan who had some students, and it appears as though they set him up to fail. They came to him and they said, what do you believe about the Prophet Muhammad? Here was the answer he gave, and he lost his life for it. He says, if you want to learn about the Prophet Muhammad, you really need to go to the Muslim clerics. He didn't say, like, I dismiss him, I reject him, he was bad, he was a bad guy, full of lies. He didn't do any of that. He just said, you should really check with your clerics. For that alone, he was arrested for blasphemy and never heard of again. Which, again, the ministry has seen this happen. They go, presumed dead. And has not yet been heard. And then 5 days later, 9/11. 9/11. TFA, where I teach my day job, I was in the room, kitty corner there when that happened. Principal knocked on the door, said, hey, Tanji, you should turn your TV on. I go, oh, okay. It's like, why am I going to turn my TV on? I'm teaching here. So I kept going. 10 minutes later, he circles back, goes, you really should turn your TV on. Turn it on, and there's the day. Watched it all happen. Well, all. The second airplane and all the things that once we kind of knew was going on. So they don't really, again, you're supposed to accept it, is the problem. And Christians don't have to be afraid of questions. If you've ever wondered, like, well, maybe he did just pass out. Maybe, there was some kind of a scheme. So look into it like we have. Read the chapter. Think about, is that a good explanation? Should I doubt the death of Jesus? And we see there's reasons to be able to see this far, because we've only done one of four things, but this far, the evidence is that the swoon theory doesn't hold up.
Just a quick follow-up. This made me think of what Greg Koval says, which is that an alternate theory isn't evidence.
Right.
And just because someone can give their alternative account for, well, I think it was this, they then have to bear the burden of proving that.
Right.
And so
Right.
we don't have to defend their point of view. If they have an alternate theory, then you shift the burden on them
Right.
and say, okay, now you defend that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. You know what I would say if people kind of talk to you about this, which, by the way, is great. If you can get spiritual conversation going with someone who's thinking these things through, it's great. Don't be afraid of that. And also don't worry if it doesn't go to the fullest length that it could possibly have gone if you wished it had gone. Let it go as far as the conversation will go, especially if you know them even just a little bit, because you can talk at another time. Especially in workplaces, you're like, I want to talk for the next 5 hours about this, but, you know, can only talk for a short while, then we go back and then maybe we'll talk again, those kind of things. But, you know, it's really, someone says like, well, maybe he died. Now, why do you believe that? Well, I don't know, coulda. Well, how so? I mean, I'm not saying everyone, but the vast majority of people go like, well, I don't know, I just heard that. Same thing, well, what about all those Bible contradictions? I can't follow that. What Bible contradictions are you aware of that bother you? Well, I'm not really sure I know of any, but I've heard of them. Now, I'm not saying nobody will bring up something, but the vast majority will know. Why is that helpful for them? They're feeling very comfortable in their misunderstanding. And they need to realize, oh yeah, I'm dismissing this because there could be contradictions, or Jesus probably just survived that and just left. There's a plot. Oh, really? Defend that. Once they realize, I don't know, I'm grasping at straws, that's actually helpful for them. To go like, well, maybe I don't know. Lee Strobel admits as much, a little bit in the introduction of this book and then other places. But he admits, he goes, you know, I hadn't really looked deeply into why Christianity wasn't true. He goes, I didn't want it to be true. He was driven by immoral lifestyle. He didn't want any accountability to God. And so anytime you heard a little something like, maybe Jesus not, yes, good enough. Rather than really digging down and asking those questions. You know, I mentioned before that Lee Strobel started to sound more like a seeker than a skeptic at this point in the book. Listen to what he says at the end of chapter 11. Some of you may have noticed this when you read it. He says, those who seek to explain away the resurrection of Jesus by claiming that he somehow escaped the clutches of death at Golgotha need to offer a more plausible theory that fits the facts. And then they too must end up pondering the haunting question that all of us need to consider. What could possibly have motivated Jesus to willingly allow himself to be degraded and brutalized the way that he did? That question is shifting from, well, what happened? I don't know, what happened? To, why did it happen? Which is the crucial question. Because we're not arguing simply that Jesus was a nice man, probably didn't deserve the fate he got. That's probably happened time after time after time after time in all societies and all cultures everywhere. Okay? The question is, was he something more? You know, sometimes people say, well, you know, I can't believe in the resurrection because people don't just come back to life. I said, I know. I'm not arguing that Jesus was just a person that maybe came back to life for no reason. I'm arguing that if he came back to life, he's God. And that's the difference. Okay? Well, I want to let you go because of the promise of time, right? I will hang around and we can chat. You know, a lot of times I go over, and so I'm really proud of myself. 2 weeks in a row, I have met my time deadline. You will notice on the bottom of that page we just finished up, there's just a reminder about next week. We will talk about the empty tomb, and chapter 12 is the corresponding chapter in the case for Christ. I think this is it. I should have picked Chris to confirm that, but I think we're good. We filled the room. They can't kick us out, right? So thank you for coming. Have a blessed week. See you in a week, I hope.